So in our last video, we talked about the methods that Harding and her co-authors use and how they compare to the methods of Card and Kruger. In this video, we're going to go over their main results. So the big picture of what they find is that wages do increase as a result of the minimum wage increases that Seattle experienced. But in contrast to Card and Kruger, they're going to find pretty significant negative effects on employment. So they're going to find that hours of work and number of jobs decrease below this threshold of $19 an hour. They're going to actually find that these negative effects on employment are so big that they might have slightly reduced the overall payroll received by low-wage workers. In other words, that the estimated elasticity of labor demand might have been less than one, greater in absolute value than one. Right, so that a 10% increase in wages would cause a greater than 10% decrease in employment. So to walk through this, the first thing you might want to know is, how do these minimum wage increases actually affect wages? Right, as we talked about before, when we talked about the synthetic control method, we're going to see that Seattle and synthetic Seattle are going to look very, very similar in terms of wages up until this first minimum wage goes into effect. So we're not seeing much evidence that Seattle businesses anticipated the minimum wage and started raising wages early. After the minimum wage goes into effect, indeed we see that the average wages of Seattle workers who are earning less than $19 an hour goes up relative to synthetic Seattle workers, right? And again, it goes up after the $15 an hour minimum. This graph here, which we're going to see more of, is going to say, maybe you're worried here that we've just picked a synthetic Seattle that gives us a particular result, right? We've picked a particular way of weighting all of these different non-Seattle micro-statistical areas. Let's just say counties, non-Seattle counties. Here what we're going to do is we're going to graph Seattle in dark black and every other county in gray. And so what we can see is that Seattle was in the middle of all of these counties up until that minimum wage goes into effect, after which it goes up to being one of the highest wage counties. Highest wage, but higher than the bulk of the other micro-statistical areas. And if we look at this in a regression, we're going to see exactly what we just talked about. Before the minimum wage went into effect, right, you're going to see that wages in Seattle, wages in Seattle and synthetic Seattle among local workers is basically the same. After the $11 an hour minimum wage goes into effect, wages in Seattle and then after the $13 minimum wage goes into effect, they grow even more, right? So that by the last period that we look at here in 2016, wages are about 3.3 percentage points higher, 3.3% higher in Seattle than they are in synthetic. So that's kind of the first order, most basic thing that we could expect to see from a minimum wage, right? Is that it is in fact going to increase wages. The important question is, what does this do to hours of work and number of workers employed? So if we look at hours of work, we're going to see the same pattern that Seattle and Seattle have very, very similar patterns in terms of the average hours worked by workers below this wage threshold before the minimum wage goes into effect. So an important thing to point out here is we don't see evidence of this story that we were worried about with Card and Kruger, that businesses are using attrition to reduce their payroll before the minimum wage goes into effect. We see maybe a little bit of a drop in employment in Seattle ahead of the first minimum wage increase, but nothing really in the months after the minimum wage increase passes. On the other hand, what we see is that employment hours worked falls in Seattle after the first and second minimum wage increase, while it rises in synthetic Seattle. And so if we use a classic difference in difference framework, right, to compare Seattle with synthetic or Frankenstein or Bizarro Seattle, what we're going to conclude is that the minimum wage caused pretty significant hours declines in Seattle relative to Wilson. And again, if we compare Seattle to all of these different PUMAs, right, all of these comparison areas, we're going to see that Seattle is just about in the middle of all of its comparison groups up until those minimum wages go into effect, at which point it has some of the fewest hours worked. Okay. So that was looking at hours worked. Maybe we care about number of jobs, right? We might actually think that hours worked could go down for reasons that are good for employees, right? Maybe if I'm a college student and I go from earning $9 an hour to earning $11 an hour, maybe I actually cut back on the number of hours I request, right, because of an income effect. So if we see just a reduction in hours but not a reduction in jobs, we might interpret that differently. On the other hand, if we look at number of jobs, we're going to see the same sort of pattern here, right? We're going to see that Seattle and synthetic Seattle look pretty similar before the minimum wage goes into effect, right? Pretty similar up until the moment that the minimum wage actually, so similar up to passage, similar up until the minimum wage actually goes into effect. And then there's a drop in the number of jobs in Seattle paying less than $19 an hour relative to the number of jobs in synthetic Seattle. We go to this Puma by Puma view, we're going to see the same thing, right? Seattle is just about in the middle, sometimes even near the top, up until the minimum wage goes into effect. And then it's got levels of employment for low-wage workers that are below all of its comparisons. And again, in a regression view, we're going to see the same thing, right? Before the new minimum wage goes into effect, no real differences. After the minimum wage goes into effect, if we look at hours and number of jobs, we're going to start to see differences, but then we see really significant differences once the minimum wage goes up to $13 an hour, right? So that by the end here, we're going to see about a 7% decline in the number of jobs and a 9% decline in the number of total hours, right? That is hours per worker, the effect of a change in hours per worker plus an effect in the change in jobs. So the last thing they want to look at here is they want to say, since we know that wages went up, but the hours worked goes down, how does the payroll of all employers who are employing people at less than $19 an hour change, right? Are the workers who remain employed getting more money into their pockets than workers got before the minimum wage goes into effect? And what they're going to find is that with this first minimum wage increase from $11 to $13 an hour, the answer looks to be yes. But with the second minimum wage increase, the answer looks to be. So if you believe their results, if you think that this increase in payroll that we see in synthetic Seattle would have happened in real Seattle if not for the minimum wage increase, you would conclude that workers end up actually poorer after the minimum wage increase than they would have been before. And again, we can see the same view and in a regression. Okay, that's great. So in the next video, we're going to talk about why we might see some of these differences in this paper versus the Carden-Kruger paper.